Hi everybody, my name is Peter Laws from the Flicks the Church Forgot, the show that explores the deeper and sometimes spiritual themes of horror. This is the second part in a three-part episode looking at a recent crop of haunted house movies. Now, if you'd like to hear my thoughts on the excellent New Zealand film Housebound, then you can find that in the previous episode. But for now, we're going to pull our car into a creepy little New England town where the dead aren't really dead enough, and we are still here.
I know you think it's silly, but I really can feel something here, Paul.
So what are we gonna do about it?
What if Jacob and May came up for the weekend? She told me once that people pay her to do seances.
This house has an energy all its own. We don't need to find the darkness here, Paul. It's everywhere.
You're not leaving here. You stay, you satisfy the darkness. Every 30 years or so, the goddamn place just wakes up! And it demands new blood!
Now, before we dive into this film, just a quick note. Did you notice how in the trailer for We Are Still Here, it features a very common musical choice in film promotion at the moment, having heavy, low, and rhythmic synth stabs punctuating the action on the screen. It's like, bow, bow. A while ago, trailers were filled with swirling strings hitting crescendos at the end, but at the moment, these like hefty boom sounds, which are cool, I like it. They're really out there a lot, so have a look out for trailers like this, because this technique is very much trending at the moment. And another trend that's hard to miss in modern cinema is how many old school horror films are coming out. Earlier films like House of the Devil and a slew since have been pushing the 70s and 80s sensibility, style and pacing and techniques into horror stories. There's films before House of the Devil certainly as well who do that. Thinking about it, it's not surprising. Many of the directors and writers of these films were growing up in those eras, and so that era has left a lasting stylistic mark on their brain. It's similar to how some 70s and 80s horror movies kept nodding back to 1950s monster movies. This recent horror spurt suits me fine, this retro horror spurt, because I'm from that generation and I get a kick out of these contempo retro flicks. Not that that's a word, but I guess it is now. Anyway, We Are Still Here is a contemporary retro film set in 1979. It's about a couple who are trying to get over the death of their son, and they move into a house where strange things start to occur. Could it be their son who was trying to communicate? Okay, this is a classic, and some might even say cliched, setup for a ghost movie. The grieving parents wondering if the spooks they see are their dead kids, or in fact hoping it might be. Don't Look Now is one of the finest examples of a film that follows this idea. But what's cool about We Are Still Here is that it takes that traditional grieving parents model and it starts to move it in a much more sort of high octane, out there storytelling direction. The house they move into has a controversial history. It's sort of in the middle of a field like this, and as you heard in the trailer, it was owned by the Dagmar family, who used it as a funeral home. Not the sort of thing you'd say is a plus point, but for so many of these movies, it knocks the house price down a bit, so attractive to some people. This, oh my word, we're living in a funeral home angle, echoes the real case of the Snedeker family. In 1986, they famously moved into a house in Southington, Connecticut, which used to be a funeral parlor, and later they claimed that all sorts of Fortean freakiness kicked off, from ghosts and visions of a sinister male figure to both parents claiming that they were raped and sodomized by demons. So yeah, if you're a hedonist, a ghost, then it's quite the party house. But anyway, whether this case, the Snedeker case, was legitimate or not, it's very difficult to tell, but the Snedeker's claims were popular enough to spawn the 2009 film A Haunting in Connecticut, which I've seen and is okay. It's an ultimately forgettable horror movie, but it's all right. So We Are Still Here does borrow this motif, this idea of living in a funeral home, but it's not related in any other way to the Snedeker case or The Haunting in Connecticut. What's cool is that the backstory of this house in We Are Still Here is not just that it was a funeral home, but that the owners of it were corrupt. Like you heard in the trailer, these guys were swindling the townspeople and selling the corpses there to be made into chop suey. There's more to it than that, and it's described in the film, but it's a deliciously macabre and twisted take, and it certainly brings a new element to this particular haunted house story, as you'll see if you watch it. But as the supernatural starts pressing into this couple's lives even further, they need to bring in the help of a couple of quirky spiritualist friends, and in time the house starts to reveal beyond a shadow of a doubt that something really is still there, or rather, someone. Now, We Are Still Here had a lot of film festival buzz and notched up some great reviews. It's got a solid, fun, persuasive edge. And what I especially liked about We Are Still Here is that it concentrates on older people. The main characters are, I'm guessing, in their 50s, and call me twisted, but I always quite enjoy seeing older people in supernatural peril. That's not because I have something against my elders, of course, but it's just that so much of the cookie-cutter horror movies tend to focus on teenagers or young people who are facing doom. And they do this, of course, so that it connects with the typical horror audience demographic that might be more of the teenage variety. For example, Metrodome Pictures sent me a press copy this morning of a new horror movie called Lost After Dark. And once again, this is a retro horror riffing on 80s slasher movies. It's got a group of teenagers stranded and end up getting chased by a cannibal. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily boring. I'm actually really looking forward to it. It's had some pretty good reviews from what I've seen. But what I'm saying is that in horror, young people in peril is normal. Older people in peril feels unique and different. In fact, I read a really good quotation the other day from a film critic called Andrew Mangravate. I think that's how you pronounce him. And he was speaking of Hammer horror, and he wrote this. He says, 2 things drew us, the kids in the front row seats, to Hammer films. Their tremendous sense of style and the chance they afforded us to peer into the adult world. We knew that these films didn't look like any other horror films. Also, the action in Hammer's films didn't play like anyone else's action. What was going on in them wasn't our wish fulfillment, wasn't our surrogates trashing the adult world that was ignoring us. It was adults trashing other adults. I think that's a really insightful quote. There's something disturbing about seeing people who are older than you and are theoretically supposed to be wiser than you doing bad things to one another. You know, the older I get, the less chance I have of seeing that happen because there's less people who are older than me. But it happens that in We Are Still Here, we see older people doing things that are weird and dangerous and out of control. You might even argue that the title itself is a statement. The older generation have not vanished. They haven't grown out of horror. They haven't somehow risen above genre movies. They're still here making exploitation films, and I think that's pretty cool. These retro horrors, the contemporary retro horrors then, they hark back to the 70s and 80s, and they often appeal to an older audience anyway, so therefore they can afford to have main characters that the viewers can relate to, an older group. But also these filmmakers are so influenced by the films from decades past that they cast actual icons in them, in the modern films, and these icons are by default older, and so it means naturally the age range of the cast is going to up a bit, but we'll discuss more of that in a moment. But one of the things that works best about We Are Still Here is its style. You can spot the fingerprints of horror's past all over it. The director himself has said that he was influenced by the made-for-TV horror movies of the late 70s, Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, Dark Night of the Scarecrow, and this is a genre that I am a huge fan of. There is still something about 70s made-for-TV horror films that creeps me out, almost by default. But you can also spot design influences in We Are Still Here from Dark Shadows, John Carpenter's The Fog. There's nods to American Werewolf in London. Nightmare on Elm Street gets a particularly clear nod. Lovecraft, Stephen King, they're all listed as massive influences on the film, and you can see it on the screen. Don't Look Now, I mentioned earlier, that influence can be spotted, I would say, in the house itself, which has got that similar home in a field look, something like here. But the most blatant influence on We Are Still Here is horror maestro Lucio Fulci, and in particular his film The House by the Cemetery. It's a Incidentally, if you're interested, you can hear me talking about Fulci in my audio episode on Zombie Flesh Eaters, a 2-part episode. So Ted Geoghegan, I'm not quite sure how you say his name, the director, he chose to name pretty much every character in We Are Still Here after someone in the house by the cemetery, so it's a very clear salute to Fulci. There's a raft of horror references that in some ways I'm liking the film better after watching it than I did during watching it. And that's because the references are dawning on me more and more when I think about them. For example, there's a scene where a ball bounces down the stairs of a cellar, I think it is. And when I first saw it, it's early on in the film, I immediately thought, oh, they're ripping off The Changeling. That's one of my favorite films, and they're just ripping it off blatantly. And in that moment, I wasn't really impressed. I thought, oh, this film is supposed to be really good, and it's just being lazy. But then in time, I started to realize that the film was so littered with these sorts of nods. You know, like the feet going through the stairs, like custard stuff, like fiery custard in Elm Street, you know. You realize that it's not laziness, it's a blatant love letter to horror. So instead you think, cool, he's not ripping off The Changeling. He's directly quoting The Changeling. And then it's like, fine, I like it. So if you're a horror fan, I do think you'll enjoy We Are Still Here. But if you're not, I think you might wonder what the fuss is about. I'm not shocked to see that some of the general reviews to this, not all, but some have been a little bit lukewarm. And I think perhaps it might be because they don't appreciate the stylistic nods to horror history that you'll find here. Whereas I guess the genre-savvy critics or the nerds seem to think it's brilliant because it's almost like they speak the film's language. Speaking of stylistic choices, there is one aspect of this film which I was surprised at first. I thought that the nods to retro horror were so frequent in We Are Still Here that the director, I was surprised that he hadn't chosen a musical style to fit with that period in the score. I wondered at one point, why didn't he ask Fabio Frizzi to compose the music? Whoa, let me just stop this episode right there. I got a problem. Basically, when I got home to edit this episode, I realized that the last 5 minutes or so of the episode were corrupted in some way. They weren't able to be shown. I only had the audio and not the video, and I was like, oh no, what am I going to do? Am I going to have to go back into the creepy field at this time of night and try and sort it out? I decided no, I'm going to do the rest of the episode here. But with a little bit of movie magic, let's go into We Are Still Here to continue talking about, what was it again? The music. That was it. I was talking about Fabio Frizzi, the music, We Are Still Here. That's it. For example, I wondered if he'd considered inviting Fabio Frizzi to compose the music for this film. Ty West did a retro nod with his main title music for the absorbing horror The House of the Devil, and so I wondered if at first the director here might have missed a trick with the score he did choose. Now that's not to say that Wojciech Golczewski's soundtrack isn't any good. In fact, it actually is very good. I'm listening to it quite a lot at the moment on Spotify. I'm really enjoying it. But it's still one of those abstract synth scores with some melody but not a lot of it. And I wondered if Fabio Frizzi's approach, that sort of style, would have really pumped the film full of melody and retro chic. But then I wondered if modern audiences would just laugh at weird saxophones and drum beats being played over this. But then more importantly, I remembered the score to Dark Night of the Scarecrow, which, if you remember, was talked about as a major influence on this. That 70s TV movie has a score, which is also on Spotify, incidentally, which is ahead of its time, and that is indeed a synth-based, often atonal score. And so oddly enough, I've concluded that the music choice in We Are Still Here is still really quite fitting with the retro yet modern vibe. Still though, I would have gotten a kick out of seeing this action happening with funky bass lines and 70s Italian breakbeats. Maybe someone out there online could edit a version of this film together with a bit of Fabio Frizzi or Stelvio Cipriani or something like that, just to see what those funky beats might have worked like in the midst of this.
The realtor told you all about the Dagmars, huh?
Yes, that was the family who first lived here, right?
We had heard it was a funeral parlor around the turn of the century. Don't say.
Old Dagmar had run the bodies and was burying empty coffins. Some even said he was selling to the Orientals over in Boston, turning them into jumpsuits. Wasn't long after that the trouble began.
Anyway, Getting back on track to the cast, Barbara Crampton, who's probably her most famous role was in Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, where she had that infamous head gives head scene, the sort of few seconds of film that if anybody wandered in and saw you actually watching it, they would seriously consider calling the psychiatrist on your behalf. She was also in the brilliant From Beyond, as well as plenty of other films as well. So seeing her again in a film, in a horror film, instantly presses the nostalgia buttons and gives you a cool feeling about the movie, but she is more than just her CV and her history. She does a very, very good job of playing a haunted mother, coping with the unfolding madness around her, and there's just something in her eyes, this wide stare of hope and dread, that I think works really well for the film. Also, it's good to see Andrei Sensenig, who plays the father. He's got a great receding perm going on, which when coupled with the 1979 styling and the glasses make him look the perfect level of like kooky, but I guess he was cool for the time appearance. He's one of those actors that you recognize, but you can't quite remember where from because he crops up in all sorts of films in supporting roles. Lisa Marie does a great job as the spiritualist, but I do want to give special mention to Larry Fessenden, who I just think is cool in pretty much everything he's in. Fessenden, as you may well know, is not just an actor, but actually the list is endless. He's a producer, editor, director, cinematographer, writer, mentor to many horror directors, and he's put out some excellent horror movies like The Last Winter, but in particular, one of my favorites of his, which is Wendigo from way back in 2001. Try Wendigo. It's a touching, creepy horror movie that's really worth checking out. But on screen, he has this infectious presence. There's just something like wild and kooky about him when he's on screen. I really like him. And in We Are Still Here, you could say that he overacts a bit, but in some ways that's just the choice he makes in the film, and you're quite happy to go along with that. I think it was great to see him in this. Also, there's one more cast member who I really enjoyed, and that was Monty Markham. He's one of those guys that you'll instantly recognize, at least I did, when he strolled on. Like, who is this guy? Like Sensenig, I recognize him, but what from? Well, looking back over his career, I discovered that he's been in loads of 80s TV shows, from Quincy, The A-Team, The Incredible Hulk, The Golden Girls. He was even in the premiere of the Canadian Lassie show, The Littlest Hobo, which is a program that all British people of a certain age can vividly remember, particularly the theme tune. I just love how a film can bring back an actor and some of these other actors and still give them interesting roles in this. He's great here as the creepy, polite townsman, and he's quite the dapper Dan for a guy of 80. So as well as this solid cast, you've got a haunted house story that moves, like I said, into some high energy levels and unusual areas. And I won't give anything away, but it's common knowledge in the posters and in other reviews that the film does not just go for spooks. It also pushes on that gore button as well. I wonder if you like whiskey, you're going to love this film because it seems like it's the only thing that anybody drinks. But nothing wrong with that. So do check out We Are Still Here if you haven't already. Maybe make a double bill with Housebound and see how the two of them hold up together, especially because they are both by first-time directors. And I think that shows a great deal of promise for the future of genre flicks when you've got two inventive films like this. So that's it for this second episode in the Haunted House series of the Flicks the Church Forgot. Join me next time for the final home we'll be looking at, where I'll be reviewing the upcoming UK DVD release of The House on Pine Street. But until then, please share and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Rev Peter Laws and on Facebook, or read my column in the Fortean Times magazine. Oh, and don't forget the Flicks the Church Forgot.